This is the Listening Project podcast, sharing our stories to amplify our voices, a project of the RPA. We are Richmond organizers who have listened to residents who are the most harmed by some of the biggest polluters in our rich city. These are our stories.
My grandma still lives in Richmond. A lot of my friends and family, my mom still lives, in Richmond. So it just, like I say, man, I feel like my family have no choice. They walk outside. They paid all their tax money, their tax dollars. They work every day. They work hard just to get ahead in life. But all to be, trumped by this multi-million-dollar company that's not really for us. It's no just us. It's just us. It's no justice. It's just us. And so that's kind of what, like, I've been, like, my mindset about how Chevron and just, even the justice system and all this other stuff that we're faced with. It's like, look, man, y'all are not helping. Y'all hindering us, and we need y'all help more than what y'all doing. And y'all looking at the way that like you want to look at it to help us, and it's not helping us because our kids are still, facing all these different problems, all these different the birth defects, and just growing up with all these different ailments, and it's stuff that we need to. If we got out of Richmond, if we remove Chevron out of Richmond, I think it would help us a lot more. We would lose money, but I think in the long run, our health is more important than the money.
Saeed again with the fire. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Listening Project podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about who pays the price for fossil fuel operations in our city and a little bit about the good people doing the good work to make our city a little better.
I'm Danny. Nice to be back.
And I'm Sol. And just like Alfredo said, today's episode, we really are going to talk about all the ways in which we are impacted and at whose expense. And so we'll briefly talk about these impacts in future episodes. And today we're going to talk lightly around the different health conditions, economics, the politics, a little bit more about the environment and workers.
Yeah, I actually had the pleasure of speaking to Amanda Milstein, who is a doctor and pediatrician here in Richmond. So we're going to start off listening to her.
Rates of asthma that we see. The kind of most recent data that I've seen, which is now outdated, but is now a few years old, basically showing that on average, Richmond as a whole suffers from rates of asthma that are twice the national average. Which is very accurate in terms of just anecdotally my experience. I previously, prior to practicing in Richmond, had been in San Francisco and then San Leandro, and certainly appreciate the higher rates of asthma in Richmond. One of the things that was most striking to me when I first started practicing in Richmond was the sort of expectation from families that their children would develop asthma, and the sort of inevitability of it, the sort of sense of like, that we know this is going to happen. The question is when. And I remember the first few times this happened, I was just very confused and really kind of didn't quite understand what was going on. But I remember I'd go in to meet a newborn baby and their family, a baby just a few days old. And one of the first questions the family had for me was, does my child already have, does our baby have asthma? And, I tried to, the first few times I got asked that, I really tried to explain, like, from a very scientific, this is what asthma is like. And it is, something, it will take several, episodes of wheezing to get a diagnosis of asthma, and trying to sort of say, no, this, you shouldn't be worried about this yet. Your baby is only 3 days old. And the more I got to know the community and understand the kind of context in which all of this was unfolding, I pretty quickly came to understand how reasonable of a question that is, and that for the majority, for many of my families and their kids, their question is the right one, which is when will my kid develop asthma?
And that's honestly the reality. The baby brother that I spoke of just had a baby. So we just welcomed our 4th generation into the world. And very similarly, it was, when do we expect to have symptoms? When will we know? How can we test him? When's the earliest test? What other effects can we have? It wasn't if. There was never an if. It was simply, we expect this to happen. Now we need to know more so we can combat it within our family. And so that really resonates with me. Thank goodness, my beautiful nephew is now 9 months old and hasn't had the symptoms, but that's just one kid, right? That doesn't have those symptoms. How many others have had symptoms of asthma really early on, been on breathing treatments? And we actually asked our community about this. So when we surveyed folks, we asked our 217 folks, do you or a family member have a chronic respiratory illness? And Danny, Alfredo, you want to guess what that number might be?
I'm guessing it's pretty high.
Yeah, I've heard the statistic like 1 in 4 kids will have or develop asthma. So I'm going to go with like a 30% there.
It's so unfortunate to even say this, but it's a staggering 52%. More than half of the folks that we interviewed either have or are related, not just know of somebody, but are actually related to somebody that has a chronic respiratory illness. Mm-hmm. And so this is just, we see it again and again. We've grown up with it, and I'm really interested to hear other folks, and we're going to have an episode on public health to really dive deeper. But I would love to hear your thoughts, Alfredo.
Yeah, this was a really common thing that we heard like through our interviews, was asthma, literally. Even like, it was kind of weird. Sometimes there was like 6 people that were like, do you know anybody with a chronic respiratory illness? And they were like, no, but then they still put asthma. So it's like, even for people who like we kind of maybe don't look at those too hard, but even for like, I think of it as like, even people who don't know, people know that this is a problem in the community. We're going to listen now to Lisbeth Ibarra, which is a young activist from Youth versus Apocalypse, very, very deeply rooted here in Richmond.
So the way that like I've seen it, like I feel like Chevron impacts me personally, is that also I know that there's like a lot of like asthma is one thing that runs in my family. And I know like cancer also runs in my family. So just like all of these like respiratory illnesses, like I'm scared that like, what if one day like I develop them just because of the air that I'm breathing? And I also get scared because the climate crisis is, in one way or another, is going to keep impacting everyone. And Chevron is contributing to the climate crisis. So eventually, like, we're going to, like, all be displaced because there's so many natural disasters that come with climate change. And there's so many, like, terrible things. So it just gets scary because, like, as a young person, like, we're going to have the most time left on this planet. And we're the ones being left with all of the consequences.
I think like Lisbeth really understands what the problem here is, or I think Lisbeth does a good job at like explaining what the problem is here, and like expressing the fear that we have of like, yes, where will we go? Where will we go when things get too bad? Yes. You know, like we're like more and more we're noticing, we're understanding that we are in a crisis, that things need to change, and like companies like Chevron that profit off of the chaos going on, or at least the things driving the chaos, don't really want to do much of that change. And when we try to hold them accountable, it's like what can we do? Marco, who Marisol, you know Marco a little more. You want to introduce?
Yeah. Marco, incredible community leader as well at Urban Tilth, and from Richmond. And he really goes, when we posed a question around, what's the impact of Chevron, he really brings up many different points that we're going to dive deeper into. And so I'm super excited to hear his voice.
Right now, I think is especially a good time to ask these kind of questions because you got to consider that gas and a lot of the prices for everything in the economy is going up. So they're kind of nervous with us putting pressure on them right now, especially because they have this like obligation, I guess, to their greed and their profits and their stockholders. So they're going to be cutthroat about it. They're going to bring out all the lawyers and make sure that they come out on top or they sweep it under the rug. Richmond Standard is funded by Chevron, and they never have any stories about Chevron. I rarely hear any news stories about Chevron flaring, the community's concerns, like on Facebook. I was reading like everybody coming out, oh, anybody know about this smell, the leak, blah, blah, blah. And the very next day, people are complaining about sideshows. And so I'm wondering why people have selective hearing at the top. And I mean, I kind of know the answer to that question, but it's like even the progressive people in our city, they sort of kind of dance around that question, or they don't like go hard enough, in my opinion. So at the end of the day, it just feels like people do lose a lot of hope in our government, in our city, and also nationally. And I think that's kind of I think that's their goal too, is building this distrust, building this hopelessness and helplessness, and feeling like our vote doesn't really matter, so why even show up? And that's a big problem.
Yeah, actually, I want to bring up one issue that Marco brings in, which is it's interesting how whether it's different folks from different sides, conservative or progressives, they really dance around the issue of public health as a public safety issue. Mm-hmm. We talk about there's flaring, there's a gas smell, there's an explosion, this isn't right. But then the next day, we have droves of people going online talking about sideshows. Mm-hmm. And to me, if we really look about this is deeply rooted in racism, whether it's a crime against no one, I'll say this, no one is looking at the crime that Chevron commits to our Black and brown brothers and sisters every fucking day. But yet they will go after Black and brown folks who are about their culture, who are holding on to the one thing that they have about their culture. And so we can think about Chevron and their white collar crimes that literally get unaccounted for every single day. But then when there's a larger issue happening in our community around rarity of sideshows, and then all of a sudden there's so many different people. And it resonates with me because we need to see the intersectionality. Public health is a public safety issue.
I think you make a really good point when you talk about like public safety as it relates to this, because it goes like deep beyond, like Marco says, like the misinformation that we hear, like the propaganda machine that is the Richmond Standard. Like when we talk about public safety, people tend to omit before we had this huge contrast of like really low income communities and higher middle income families living next to each other, like we had when is it that this like shift happened? Because like we had industry in the community, we had jobs, we had a lot of investment in the community, and when all of that left is when all of these things started to change. And so like when we talk about public safety, we don't talk about the fact that our communities lack investment, that corporations left us in the state that we are today. And so like let's listen to Minerva talk about politicians and the political atmosphere here in Richmond.
These politicians have been bought out. They've been bought out by Chevron, and that's why it's continuing to happen. And that's why they're still here, because they just have money and they're putting money in other people's pockets.
Yeah, I mean, as a new kind of person here in Richmond and in the area, this is the sentiment I got from a lot of people. This is kind of the vibe that I get. And, you know, I think there's no discounting that. It is the traditional way, but I have hope. I got to talk to Gail McLaughlin, who was a former mayor, current city council member, a progressive who has tried so hard to kind of turn the tides here in Richmond to, you know, keep Chevron accountable, and to do the work that has needed to be done for a really long time. So I want to play a clip from her, and yeah.
I was very strong as mayor in making it clear that we needed to put strong conditions on air emissions. And so some of those conditions did get approved, not all of them. We still didn't have a progressive majority on the council, so not all of those got approved, but a good many of them did. So it was a cleaner project, still not exactly and so what we want, but we considered it a victory nonetheless, because had we not worked as a coalition and pressuring Chevron to reduce those emissions, it would have been another bad project. So the modernization project was something that offered some good policy controls on them. We also had we modified the, it was called I'm trying to think what it's called, the Industrial Safety Ordinance. We strengthened that. And like I said, we sued Chevron for its neglect of the refinery over decades, which led to the terrible 2012 fire where 15,000 people were sent to local hospitals for respiratory ailments. So, you know, as a result of that, we pushed forward and got some heavy duty changes. Chevron was convicted for willful neglect of the refinery. So that was partially because we worked closely with regulatory agencies. We held countless meetings in Richmond where the community weighed in on the problems and the harm that was caused as a result of this fire. And so we pushed back and got some regulations on them, but not enough to say we are, you know, out of the woods. We still have this major refinery in our city that causes harm, and they're still refining fossil fuels.
Yeah, so obviously I wasn't here in 2012. Can you guys kind of tell me what happened?
Yeah, so I mean, besides, you know, lived personal experience, we did dive a little deep into more or less like what happened during the fire. And so the fire that you're hearing about is a massive explosion that happened at the Richmond refinery in August of 2012. This explosion, for a lot of us that now do work, you know, I was 12 at the time, but now that I am, you know, focusing on environmental justice, like this was one of those big pieces in like our modern history that really reflects the neglect that Chevron shows for the community, and like in literally just not maintaining the refinery as they should have. You know, like they were like literally charged by the government for willful neglect, like she talks about.
Yeah, and I actually wasn't here during that fire in 2012, but I remember just getting so many text messages and calls from my family around what was going on. All of a sudden, the sky is turning gray. And from doing some of the research, again, you know, around 4:30 in the afternoon, there was a rusty diesel pipe that began to leak. And it just turned into a fucking disaster.
Yeah, this from there.
Yeah. And so it's this, like, it starts at 4:30, but then people don't actually get alerted until 6:30, 2 hours later. That's when Chevron actually contacts the county to say, this is what happened. And so people needed to be in shelter in place for 2 hours and we're not. And it just really fucking bothers me because I swear, living here every Wednesday, I have heard the monthly alarm. Alfredo, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. They rehearse every single week. I know they know how to use it.
Exactly. This is just what's going on. You have this alarm where we're always ready. We hear it. We know it's working. But then why didn't they sound the fucking alarm? Why were we out in school stills? Why were we out in our work areas and exercising, whatever it was, without knowing the severe consequences that eventually local reports say sent 15,000 people to the hospitals as a result? And then all of a sudden, the next year, we get a settlement with the EPA to pay $250,000, $250,000 to 15,000 people in a city of 110,000 from a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Like, to me, that's ludicrous. And I do not understand how our families were impacted, our youth were impacted. Everybody knew what was going on. And it infuriates me that we practice for this alarm and then we don't even have it.
You know, one of the people that I was lucky enough to speak to was this woman named Lydia, who worked at one of our local healthcare centers at the time. And so, you know, like we spoke to people who have these memories of it, you know, from their house or at work or outside, but like she was literally in the hospital as people were coming in. And she talks, we talked a lot about the things that she saw that day. Let me play a little bit so we can hear.
I worked in the emergency room during that time. Okay. And I don't, you know, they're seeing people. Yes, you had people who would come in and were really sick. But then you see those people who are, and you see my coworkers who I like love dearly, trying to like make people feel better. And it's all because of greed. Fuck that. Sorry. It hurts because I saw somebody like running, like couldn't keep like the vomit in their mouth and just running towards the bathroom. Like, and you're just like, what can you do for them? You're in a hospital, you're trying to help, and there's all these people who are truly sick. And what are the long-term effects of that? And to see it and to know that it's because you just want to make hella money, you're poisoning us. Bullshit.
You can really tell for Lydia how deeply impactful this fire was for our community. Like 15,000 people, you know, I know when we think of 15,000, like it sounds like a lot, but it's like, and like those are people. Those are people that were harmed by this corporation, and we were paid out a quarter of $250,000. What, again, like you said, Marcel, what is $250,000 to this billion-dollar corporation? They don't live with these health effects. They are not the kids growing up next to a refinery. Their kids are not growing up next to a refinery. They don't have this fear. They don't understand how traumatic it is for us as a people to live with this. For whenever we see flaring from Chevron, and you see this in the people, you see it online, on social media, whenever anything happens with Chevron, people lose their shit, and rightfully, because it's scary. That day was traumatizing for a lot of us. That day, for a lot of the people that I know that do this work, that was our flipping point. That was it. And you can see it in Lydia. You can see how deep those effects were in our community.
Thank you, Alfredo. I also just want to acknowledge how emotionally triggering and emotionally exhausting and mentally exhausting it is to live in this community and to hear the same stories over and over again. I mean, Lydia is just one voice out of thousands of voices that we're trying to uplift here.
I was going to say, like, thank you to all the doctors, the nurses, everyone in the healthcare system that takes care of our people. And, you know, it's tireless work, and to literally have the visual of the corporation, of the company that is causing the harm day in and day out, and knowing it's like it could be avoided, or at least more can be done. I can't even imagine. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think, like, just to touch on one other thing that she said, that the aspect of it being for greed, for money, like we are letting this company do this in our backyard, and they're doing this for money. You know, like, we know as a planet that we need to transition away from fossil fuels, for not only for our public health as a city, but for the health of Earth, of the planet, of our global community.
And as we wind down, thank you all for joining us. And we have Roshi, who really kind of summarizes her own feelings around a lot of the impact around Chevron.
Well, I do know that it started giving back a tiny bit, but actually a number of people who work at Chevron, an enormous number of them are not Richmond residents. Chevron employees do not spend money in Richmond businesses. They usually commute far distances just to come to work and back. They don't treat the oil workers very well. I know that much. They work in very dangerous conditions. And its ties to the community was very, very little, other than having its puppet, actors on the city council up to 2013. It really had the majority of the city council. Things changed. Yeah, it did. Things changed a little bit after that, but it was absolutely horrendous. They didn't have a scholarship for the high school or anything. And even now, if you consider that the year that Chevron had that huge accident, they made $52 billion just in profit. Globally. I mean, that's like a budget of a small country, That's how much profit they made. And they didn't have like a single scholarship for high school graduates for Richmond. The Chevron has been here for 100 years. The city of Richmond has grown around it, has sprawled around it, and it didn't have a single scholarship for the graduates. It's been poisoning our air, water, and soil since, for 100 years, hasn't been given back. It's just maddening, I don't want it to give back. I want it to just not be here anymore. I want it to shut down and be replaced by some green economy, that'll help the planet and not harm the planet.
And that was Roshi really kind of highlighting all of the different intersectionalities and impacts that our community has been living, breathing, surviving through. And those sentiments around, I just don't want them to be here anymore. Like, I don't want them to give back. I just don't want them to be here anymore. Reverberated through so many different interviews constantly. It is, from what Saeed said, our help is more than just money. What she is saying, planet and people over profit. And I just think that there's just so many incredible organizations that have been fighting the good fight, that have been fighting collectively. And I think that we can't do an episode talking about the impacts and not talk about some of the amazing work that's happening in our community.
Yeah, that's a really important point to bring up, is that there is like a lot of strong, dedicated people doing a lot of the good work. Thanks to organizations like the RPA, for example, Chevron supported candidates no longer hold a majority in the Richmond City Council, so we can get a lot more good things done for the city. They're mobilizing residents to help them, vote progressives into office, to build like the No Coal in Richmond campaign, to ban natural gas in new buildings in Richmond. And go ahead.
Yeah, I think that you're totally spot on. And, it's these progressive leaders that we need to continue to not just elect, but then hold accountable. Like Marco says, like, do they have selective hearing? What's going on? And we know RPA has really been listening through this project to different residents. And there are so many other fire-ass organizations doing work, including, Urban Tilth. If you haven't heard of them, they're totally embodying what food justice looks like in Richmond and beyond. And we were even able to engage with community members at the free farm stands that Urban Tilth does weekly. And that was crucial to us as we're listening to different people. And then you think about CBE, another statewide organization that really has a cool ass model where they have researchers working with policymakers and organizers. And a huge shout out to them because they actually co-sponsored our intergenerational listening project and brought in a lot of different voices in that event.
Yeah, and I think focusing on the intergenerational aspect of our work has been a really big key for us. And I think, uplifting the youth voice has been a really, really big part of our work. For anyone who hasn't heard of Youth vs. Apocalypse, Lizbeth, who you have heard from, is actually a part of that group. And they do great work. They organize actions pretty much every Friday. And we were able to actually go to an event in San Francisco and march with all sorts of people.
Yeah, I think that that event, it was kind of like our field trip as organizers to be out there, and do community building. But it was so awesome to see Richmond leaders like a Marco out there speaking truth to power. Isabella, Izzy, we've seen and heard from her as well. And to see these folks from Richmond in San Francisco at the Salesforce building, just saying a big fuck you guys. We're here. We're going to paint murals. We're going to take up space. We're going to demand change. We're going to sit in. It was, I also just want to point out, we saw these little kindergartners, we were on our own field trip, and then these small little elementary school students are being bussed in to these events. So I just Gen Z is on fire, and Lizbeth and all of them, I can't wait to be a part and to see them running for city council, or them running for different offices and leading movements so incredibly.
Yeah, it was actually pretty funny seeing the little kids in front of the protest. It was really heartwarming. Just seeing, like you're saying, how dedicated young people are at really pushing for a clean environment. And even at that event in SF, I talked to a couple of people who had traveled pretty far to be there. I spoke to someone from Antioch who was talking about Chevron in Myanmar, and we had not only are young people engaging in conversations about local effects of Chevron, but recognizing the international, super villain that this corporation is.
Totally. And I just want to shout out, thank you for bringing up Antioch and East County all together, because they just ran a huge victory regarding a no oil drilling ban in the city. And you just see so many different communities organizing against these really negative impacts of fossil fuel industries being in our backyard. And really this huge awakening, locally in our neighborhoods, but then in these cities, in the Bay Area, and then of course overall to just simply our nation and our globe. What does this truly mean? And I'm super excited to just learn more, listen more to our collective voices. And so, yeah, I just get really excited about things like that.
Yeah, it's so tight seeing people from all over the Bay, all these different impacted communities really standing up at this point, really like understanding this is a problem and organizing and working with the like local governments to get things like these bans passed. Today, we talked on the effect that Chevron has on our health, our economics, our politics, and briefly touched on this need from our community to move away from fossil fuels. You can find links to more about the organizations that we just briefly talked about and how you can get involved with them in the show notes below. Join us next week for a conversation with City Council member Claudia Jimenez and her vision for a just transition away from Chevron's stronghold on our city. This episode is aimed at our Spanish-speaking community. So if you don't speak Spanish, we'll be back the week after with another episode in English. Take us into Listen Up, Danny.
Yeah, so we like to do a positive, hopeful message at the end of every episode. And I just want to shout out another community organization, Safe Return, who looks at the intersection of extractive industries that plague our community. Of course, the extractive industry of fossil fuel operations, but the extractive industry that is the prison complex of our community. And I spoke to Ida, who's a community organizer for them, and just such a great community member. I love her. So here's her hopeful message, and listen up.
Well, Richmond is kind of like where I got my second wing of life. I had some traumatic incidents that's happened in my life before, and I was pretty much checked out. And Richmond has a fellowship, and I entered the Richard Boyd Fellowship. It was an empowerment pathway, and it's a lot about self-advocacy. And I learned a lot of important things about, you know, life and politics and how you care for yourself and your community. And it's important to me because I've always been interested in that type of stuff, but I never really knew how to get involved. And through the fellowship, I started to get involved and realized that we're all interconnected. Our organization is really about self-sufficiency and long-term liberty, but we are all formerly incarcerated. And when we start to think about our environment and start to connect, you know, what this movement is, we realize, like, you know, that we're not getting clean water, we're not getting good food, we're not taking care of our health in there, and in fact, it's toxic. And, you know, the infrastructure itself is toxic. The chemicals are toxic. And so learning about these important issues that our society faces, I feel like happened in Richmond. And I feel like it happened in Richmond because of the people that I've met through Safe Return, and also just spending one-on-one time with them and seeing like what they have experienced the past 10, 20 years.
Love you, Richmond. Pride and purpose. And salute, man. Stay up.
And I know I ain't the hottest, but I promise Rich City I got us. Believe me, I got you. You got me, I got you. You got me, I got you. Hey, Rich City, I'll never let you go. You don't know that I love you, Rich. You don't know that I love you, Rich. Rich City, baby.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listening Project podcast. A special thanks to the Richmond Progressive Alliance for making this podcast possible. The RPA's goal is to take power back from corporations and put it into the hands of the people. To learn more, visit their website at richmondprogressivealliance.net. Thanks so much.